live in Omaha, and I have lived in Omaha ever since I was married, which was 1937. And I've always lived in Nebraska. I've traveled the world, but I live and always have lived in Nebraska. Was born in Nebraska. On my uncle's farm down near Brownville. I was publishing short things all the time after I married. And I guess I said one day, I think I'd like to write a book. And my husband said, why don't you write a book about Nathan Hale? I didn't know why I should or shouldn't write a book about Nathan Hale, but I started doing some research and found that it was very interesting, and I eventually did write a book about Nathan Hale, and that was my very first book. I called it Young Nathan. And I entered it in a contest that Westminster Press was having. It didn't win the contest, but the editor, Bill Heidegger, wrote me and said, we definitely want to publish your book. But you will have to cut it some. And so I learned early to be careful about not wasting words. Well, I just think some writers do, I believe anyway, go into too much detail, and I guess that's what I was doing on that first book. But I think the simplest way to say a thing is the best. And that means that that does cut down on wordage. I have published, I guess, at least this is what they say, 19, actually 20 published, but the 20th one was published by the Omaha Public Schools, and that's not considered a professional publisher, of course, so we just say 19. Many times I have done actual research in the area in which the story takes place. And that is the best kind. You really, if you can meet and talk to people that knew the individual about whom you're writing, that's probably the best. The two Cather books that Ruth Crone and I did together, that was fun to do, partly because we went to the island where she went summers and places where she this is before the day of air conditioning, you see, and places she would go in the summer to be more comfortable and write. And so that was fun research and turned out well. I usually figure on 2 years spent on a book, but I mean that is both researching and writing. The Omaha Reservation is only 70 miles north of us in Omaha. And my husband and later my son and I used to go up to their dances and all of those things that they were doing and enjoy them very much. And I suppose that was where I first became interested in it. And then there was a book about the LaFlesche family written about that time. And when I read it, I decided, yes, I'd like to do something about some of these people. I think they're very admirable. And so Homeward, the Arrow's Flight, which I'm going to read tonight, was among those. My friend Dorothy Dustin, who also was a writer in Omaha, and I used to go out to the cemeteries and sit down on the ground and copy names and dates and everything we could find about the LaFlesches. Homeward, the Arrow's Flight. This may sound like a strange title, but this Indian girl's name was LaFlesche, and LaFlesche means the arrow, and this will come out in the reading I'm doing tonight. The first book from which I'm going to read you is about Susan LaFlesche, the Omaha Indian who became an MD, the first American Indian MD, and of course a woman besides. I just started reading about her and thought she was so wonderful that I wanted to do something about her, and this book is what resulted. Susan half wakened, turned on her side, and opened her eyes. It was too early to get up. She plumped her pillow and closed her eyes again. But suddenly a feeling of anticipation, of something exciting in the day ahead, flooded over her. What was it? Why, of course. She sat up in bed, hugging her knees. It was the day she and her sister Marguerite were to leave the reservation for school in the East. Susan's thoughts raced back and forth between the life she knew on the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska and the unknown life to which she was going to a school called Elizabeth Institute in Elizabeth, New Jersey. What would it be like to leave the place where she had lived among Indians all her 14 years? Here she and Marguerite were respected as daughters of Joseph LaFlesche, known to his people as Iron Eye, their last chief. At Elizabeth, they would probably be known as, quote, those strange Indian girls from the West. Susan was proud of the LaFlesche name. Her father had explained to her when she was small that it was French and meant the arrow. An arrow went straight and true, and often far, to the mark, she thought. Marguerite had wakened too. Sue, come on, let's get up. This is the day, she cried. After breakfast, the two girls finished their packing. That's everything, isn't it? Marguerite asked. Let's see if we can close the trunk. Marguerite dropped to her knees beside the trunk. Suddenly she looked up at her sister with big, solemn, black eyes. Sue, she said, I'm scared. Pooh, Susan replied, silently telling her own fluttering heart to be still. The uncertainties that lay ahead were making her anxious too, but she wouldn't admit it. Although she was younger than Marguerite, she felt that she needed to take care of her. Marguerite was the most beautiful of the four LaFlesche sisters, but she was also the most delicate and was most often ill. Well, Susette went to school in the East all by herself, Susan said. I guess if she could do it, we ought to be able to do it together. Their father was a strong believer in education. He had seen long before this year of 1879 that with the buffalo gone and the white settlers, quote, coming like bees, as he put it, the Plains Indians had no alternative but to change the pattern of their lives. To that end, he was educating his children. Marguerite suddenly said, well, Susette has enough troubles of her own right here. Troubles? What troubles? Susan said. Father has decided that she is to go with Standing Bear and Mr. Tibbles as an interpreter on a lecture tour to win support for the Poncas. Susan caught her breath. Oh, Susette. It was unheard of among the Omahas that a maiden should associate in any way with men until the young brave came to court her. Many in the tribe would disapprove of her father's decision, but Iron Eye was not afraid of criticism. Susan knew well how his heart bled for their Ponca brothers, a tribe closely related to the Omahas. The Poncas had been removed from their land in Nebraska. Incidentally, it was up on the Niobrara. That is not in that sentence. To a dry place in Oklahoma called Indian Territory. Unable to adjust to the heat and drought, a third of the tribe had died by the first year's end. Standing Bear and a handful of others had left the new reservation to return the bones of their dead to the old hunting grounds in Nebraska for burial. Susan well remembered the day they had arrived at her father's door the previous spring, ragged and half-starved. And after their 1,500-mile trek, even more vivid in her memory was the day shortly thereafter, when Army officers arrived and arrested the Poncas for leaving without the permission of the reservation agent. The Poncas had then been driven off the Omaha Reservation like cattle. Susan could still remember how her father's jaw had set, so he would not say angry words. Where are they taking them? She had cried. To Omaha City, 70 miles long miles away. When news came that Standing Bear and other leaders had been imprisoned, Iron Eye and his elder daughter, Susette, had gone to see if they could help. Upon their return, they had much to report. Concerned citizens in Omaha had petitioned for the release of the prisoners, but to no avail. Then two important lawyers and a newspaperman named Thomas Tibbles had taken their plight to court. The government had contended that the Indians could not be heard in court because, quote, Indians were not people, end quote. When her father had reached this point in his account, Susan had burst out, Indians aren't people, then what are we? Patient's daughter, her father had admonished, Judge Dundee is a good and honest man. His decision disputed this foolish contention. He ruled in favor of the Indians. The Indian is a person, Judge Dundee said. So the Poncas had been released, but because their lands in Nebraska had not been restored to them, Mr. Tibbles was attempting to stir up sentiment in their favor, first through the columns in his newspaper, and then through a proposed lecture tour. Susan knew that to follow her father's wishes and set off with Standing Bear and Mr. Tibbles would be very difficult for Susette. It says turn to page 46. We'll see what we find there. The two girls, little girls, I still think of them as 12 and 14, I guess they were, took the long train ride, dirty, dusty, to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And two preceptresses, I guess, from the school came to meet them and have brought them out to the school. Well, here we are, Miss Higgins said cheerfully. You mean this? This is Elizabeth Institute. Susan stared at the tall house with its many windows and cupolas, its pillared front veranda, and its big brick chimney. Do you like it? Miss Higgins asked, smiling at the rapt look on Susan's face. Oh, it's beautiful. Come along now, we're already late for dinner. The four of them moved along a corridor, down a flight of steps, and to the open door of a large room filled with round tables at which girls were seated. Every girl's eyes were turned on the newcomers. Susan could feel Marguerite shrink back at the sight. Girls, Miss Reed said, we have two new pupils, the LaFlesche sisters. This is Susan, and this is Marguerite. The girls at the table nodded politely and began to eat again. Quiet buzz of conversation following the dead silence that had greeted the stranger's appearance. Conversation broke out again at the table. Everyone was talking at once, it seemed. Everyone except the two newcomers. In fact, Susan thought, they were talking as if she and Marguerite were not there. I'd heard that they were going to take a couple of Indians, but I didn't believe it, Susan heard one girl say. They're from way out west, I heard, where it isn't civilized at all. Well, their hair's pretty. It's shiny, isn't it? And so black. Then Susan could scarcely believe her ears at the next remark. I wonder how long it will take them to learn to speak English. Susan looked in amazement at the girl who had spoken. Marguerite had evidently heard too, for Susan heard a small giggle at her side. Susan broke into uncontrollable laughter. She isn't crying, is she? She heard one of the girls say, and at this she laughed harder than ever. Shh, Marguerite whispered, but Susan knew that she was laughing too. Susan removed her hands from her face, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and said to the staring girls, we do speak English, of course. There was a chorus of you do's, then other choruses of, oh, not really, and we're sorry. But the others soon saw that Susan and Marguerite were only amused at their mistake, so they began to laugh too. And so they settled in at the school. Elizabeth Institute is a 2-year program, and are enrolled in classes and are in class when we pick it up again. In drawing class, Susan had not paid much attention to the teacher's explanation of perspective. She noted, however, that after the teacher turned from the blackboard, the girls started working in their sketch pads. She opened hers, and without thinking what she was doing, began drawing the bones of the leg. Studying the human skeleton, in physiology class, she had really felt stimulated greatly. She wondered at the bones and how they held together like an intricate piece of machinery. How marvelously we're made, she thought, as she continued to sketch an entire skeleton. At length, she noticed that the teacher was standing beside her. "That's very good, Susan," she said, "but not what you're supposed to be doing." Susan's eyes fell in embarrassment. "Let me have that, please," the teacher said. "Now, you are to draw the railroad track as I have it on the board in proper perspective with the rails converging in the distance." Susan stared at the lines on the blackboard, then went to work. The next day, in her favorite class, Physiology and Hygiene, she did a much better job of paying attention than she had done in drawing class the day before. They had just begun the study of the muscles and their relationship to the bone structure. Miss Higgins explained, "These are the striated muscles. These muscles are attached to portions on the skeleton by the connective tissue we know as tendons. Contractions of these muscles move the bones. That's what makes us able to move an arm or a leg." Susan's hand shot up. "But I don't understand what makes them contract." "A message from the brain, Susan." Susan frowned. "How does the message get from the brain to our arm or leg?" she asked. "We'll be studying the brain and the nervous system a little later," the teacher replied. "I don't believe we should get into that now." A few minutes later, Susan's hand went up again. Miss Higgins had been explaining a second type of muscle, which she called the smooth muscle. "If these muscles don't have any sheath around them, what holds them together?" Susan asked. Miss Higgins looked thoughtfully at her inquiring pupil as she answered her question. At the end of the period, she said, "Susan, will you please stay for a moment?" "Now what?" Susan wondered. "I suppose I'm asking too many questions." As she stood by Miss Higgins' side, the teacher took a sheet of drawing paper from her portfolio. Susan saw at once that it was the skeleton she had been sketching the day before in drawing. "This is a good sketch," Miss Higgins said. "And your questions in class, Susan, are intelligent and show a genuine interest. May I ask why your interest in physiology?" Susan hesitated. "Perhaps you don't know why?" Susan found it difficult to reply. She hadn't actually formulated in words, even to herself, what she now found she was trying to say. At last she stammered, I guess it's because I'd like to know how to help people when they're hurt or sick." "I see." Miss Higgins looked more thoughtful than ever as she handed Susan's drawing back to her. And Susan herself, as she went to her next class, was so thoughtful that she bumped squarely into another girl. So they get close to the end of the second year at Elizabeth, and Miss Reed has called Susan in, and she says to her, "Your education must not stop here, Susan. You have a fine mind. It shouldn't be wasted. What about a career? What would you like to do? Would you like to teach?" "Well, they can always use help in the mission school on the reservation," Susan replied. "You expect to go back to the reservation?" "Oh, yes, of course. I want to help my people. I must help them. Only you don't know at present how you can best do it. You're young. Don't let this worry you. Just see that your education doesn't end." with graduation from Elizabeth. And so when the 2 years are up, that part of their education is over, they go back home to the reservation for the summer, and they find that they have two guests, a white woman named Alice Fletcher, who is a friend of their brother Frank, and Frank is home for the summer, and he has this friend with him, and they are writing a book about the Omaha Indians. And very soon, the white woman says, "What are you girls going to do about continuing your education?" And she tells them about a school, Hampton Institute in Virginia, that she would like to apply to for them. She has one problem, though, because when she goes to talk to Iron Eye, of course, he finds out it's a co-educational college. This would be very bad. But finally, Alice tells them, "Your father has agreed to let you go." "What changed his mind?" asked Marguerite. "The fact that he so much wants you girls to continue your education. We'll have to ask for scholarships, of course. If you declare your intention to come back to the reservation to teach, I think you'll stand a fair chance of getting them." For Marguerite, this was easy, but for Susan, it posed problems. "What if I don't come back here to teach?" she said. "Right now, doesn't it look as if you will?" Alice asked reasonably. And so she does send off resumes, applications, so forth. And finally one day she comes riding in from town, riding her horse, of course. "Ro, Marg, Sue," she called. "There's a letter from Hampton." They all came running. Rosalie opened the letter, and Susan knew by her face they were going to Hampton. And they did. But they are still on the reservation until fall. And Alice Fletcher is there too because, as I said, she is working with Frank on a book. One evening she says to Susan, "You are a conscientious and lovely child." Then she corrected herself, "Except that you're not a child, you are a woman." Susan thought, and a woman with some difficult decisions to make. She made one of those decisions very soon. "I have something I want to say to you while we're all together," she said. There was something in her voice that demanded the attention of all of them, even the two children playing on the floor. All eyes were turned on her. "It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've finally come to a decision," she said. "The human body interests me more than anything else. When something goes wrong with it, I want to know how to fix it." There was a happy smile on Rosalie's face. Rosalie's the oldest of the four girls, and she stays on the reservation, the only one who does. There was a happy smile on Rosalie's face. "You're going to be a nurse," she said. "No," Susan said. "If it is humanly possible, I am going to become a doctor." So now you know what her ambition is. Well, I see that I decided that we wouldn't read anything about the years at Hampton. This is a 2-year school again. I think it probably compared more to what we think of as our senior high schools. And so we are clear up to commencement at Hampton. All too soon it was time to dress for the commencement exercises. Before she knew it, Susan was sitting on the platform with all the dignitaries, her hands clasped in her lap to stop their trembling. She was to give the salutatorian address. When General Armstrong rose and strode to the podium, and you wonder about that general, I always wondered all the time. I never did find any explanation of why he was called General Armstrong, but he was the head of the school. When General Armstrong rose and strode to the podium, Susan's knees began to shake and the folds of her skirt started quivering. The general gave a short welcome, then announced a musical number. She knew that she was next. As the general started his introduction, Susan began silently repeating the opening lines of her speech. But when Miss Patterson reached over and touched her hand and pointed, she turned her attention again to the general. "We have received word," he was saying, "that our salutatorian has been awarded admission to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, where she will pursue the required studies to become a doctor." The room broke into deafening applause. It was as if the students were expressing their joy and pride with their hands. It went on and on. Finally, the general raised his hand for silence. "We indeed have reason to be proud. Susan is the first graduate of Hampton to be admitted to a medical school and the first Indian to be admitted at the Philadelphia College. I give you our salutatorian, Miss Susan LaFlesche." It wasn't a long speech. It was plain and without pretensions. It came from her heart. And so her audience listened, and they heard. They would have listened to anything she might have said, but they listened spellbound to the simple message of faith and work and hope, for it spoke directly to them all. They heard and understood. She could scarcely believe that she had finished, yet she had. There was applause again. She bowed to them, her friends, and smiled, then took her seat. Her part was over. Now she could sit back and enjoy the rest of the program, so she thought. But to her amazement, General Armstrong, back at the podium, turned toward her and said, "Susan, will you please come here?" Puzzled, Susan stepped to his side. The general turned toward the audience. "I believe most of you know," he said, "that at Hampton we give a gold medal to the person passing senior examinations with the highest average. This year that honor goes to Miss Susan LaFlesche." He held out a blue velvet box. "Susan, we are happy to present to you this symbol of your scholastic achievement. Congratulations." Susan was stunned. First the announcement of her admission to medical college, then her speech, and now this. She stood with humble, modestly lowered eyes. So we got her through 2 schools now, and she is loving her work at med school, as you would expect. It was just what she always wanted to do, and now she's doing it. She and her sister Rose, still on the reservation, have quite a correspondence going all the time that she is there, for that matter. But now Susan is writing to Rose and says, "Dear Rose, I'm beginning to feel as if I know a little bit about these wonderful human bodies we're blessed with, a little bit about how they operate and what makes them go wrong, and best of all, a little about what to do to help set the wrong right. Will you please send me the symptoms whenever someone's ill at home? Then I'll see if I can diagnose the case. It is so important that I be able to do this, for a doctor must understand what is causing pain or fever or other symptoms before he can treat the patient effectively." Rosalie's reply to this letter made her chuckle. Rose hadn't lost either her sense of humor or her common sense. "The most obvious symptom I see around here," she wrote, "our father's stumbling with that wooden leg of his. What is your diagnosis, Madam Doctor? I know what mine is. Also, what I would recommend is a cure." Susan knew well what she meant. Father needed a new wooden leg. So she writes back, "Your diagnosis, also recommended cure, confirmed by Dr. Sue," she wrote. I'm sending most of the money I earned this summer. I kept a little for some small gifts at Christmas. But I hope this is enough to get Father a new peg leg. But do see that he goes to Lincoln to get a proper fitting. His trouble with the one he has stems from inefficient handling of his care and careless work in fitting him. It wasn't long till another letter came from Rosalie, who gave in detail the symptoms of a disease that was plaguing Wajapah. Will you please check me on this? She said one morning to her friend, Mrs. Okami, who was, of course, also a student there, handing her the sheet she intended to enclose in a letter to Rosalie. It's for my sister on the reservation. She wrote me these symptoms. Susan got no further. What are you doing? Her friend asked in surprise. There was a note of apprehension in her tone. It is very frowned upon to practice medicine before you are a doctor. Susan was taken aback. It had never occurred to her that she might be doing anything wrong. She was merely eager to begin helping her people, and she admitted to herself in all honesty to test her own knowledge. Oh, I'm not practicing medicine, she stammered. My sister just sent me these symptoms and asked what I made of them. This was my diagnosis. Mrs. Okami continued to read from the sheet Susan had handed her. She frowned. But you are also recommending treatment, she said, and that you must not do. If they found out, they might, how do you say, remove you from medical school. Susan paled. She reached for the offending paper and tore it to bits. Oh, Mrs. Okami, she said, thank you very much. I guess it was very foolish of me. I just didn't realize. After that, she saved her diagnoses for the hypothetical cases in the textbooks, but they seemed very impersonal. And so now we get up to our third commencement, of course, at the Women's Medical College. And Susan's family has, of course, come to see her graduate, except that her father has died in the meantime while she's been at college. And she is very sad about that because, of course, the big thing to him was for his people to get education, and she had done it. But he isn't there, but everybody else is. So her brother Frank says to her, this is the day before the exercise, aren't you going to ask if you have a job waiting for you? Frank asked her, half teasing. Susan looked at him sharply. You have news? She asked. He nodded. Perhaps not exactly what you'd like to hear, but it was the best we could do. What? Tell me quickly. Her brother handed her an envelope. It's all in there, he said. You've been appointed physician to the government school on the Omaha reservation. Susan opened the envelope and read. No, it wasn't exactly what she had wanted. She had wanted to be the doctor for the entire Omaha tribe. Still, if she could help the children. Suddenly she realized they were all standing there smiling at her, waiting for her to say something. Well, thank you, Frank and Alice. Thank you for the job, and thank you for my being here, because without you, I wouldn't have had any of this. The next morning was bright and beautiful. It's a good omen, Susan thought. Soon she was sitting on the stage with her 35 classmates, searching the audience for family and friends. As the exercises proceeded, her mind went back to other commencement exercises, at Elizabeth, at Hampton. Then Susan saw that Dean Bodley had turned from the podium toward her. In some confusion, she rose and stepped forward. We have, in this graduating class, Dr. Bodley said, an outstanding young woman, an Omaha Indian, the first woman of her race to become a doctor, Miss Susan LaFlesche. Applause broke out, but the dean held up her hand for silence. This in itself makes us very proud here at Women's College. But the fact that Miss LaFlesche plans to return to minister to her own people, makes her story even more satisfying. But there is more. The climax, you might say. She looked at Susan, who was experiencing a mixture of emotions, happiness, embarrassment, bewilderment, and the dean's eyes twinkled. The climax, she repeated, of which even Miss LaFlesche herself is not aware. Susan's brows drew together. She had thought Dean Broadley was going to make the announcement that she was one of the 6 to remain and intern at the hospital that summer. But now there is something else? Of the 36 members of the class of 1889, Dean Broadley continued, Susan LaFlesche has consistently maintained the highest scholastic average so that she graduates at the head of her class. Now the applause broke out, and Dean Broadley made no effort to stop it. She did work as the doctor to the school for just 2 years, and then she was finally given the job that she wanted. I doubt that she got any more money, but I don't know. So I'm just going to read you a little page that I called Epilogue that I put in at the end so that you will know how things all turned out. Susan LaFlesche Picot's work as a physician continued for many years. After she and Henry were married in 1894, they lived for a time in the town of Bancroft. Although Bancroft was on the Omaha Reservation, its population was made up of both whites and Indians. Susan doctored them all. At night, she placed a lighted lantern on her doorstep to guide those anxiously seeking a doctor. Her hope for a family was fulfilled with the birth of 2 sons. Henry, her husband, died in 1905, and the next year Susan moved to the new town of Walt Hill, which had been founded in the center of the Indian population. Here she built a tall house just across the street from Sister Marguerite and her husband Walter. Over the mantel she put a brass plate bearing the words, East, West, Home's Best. Always her home was very dear to her. From the days of her early work on the reservation, she had dreamed of a hospital to serve the area. After years of hard work on her part, a hospital was finally built in Walt Hill, and for a few years she had the opportunity to work in a modern medical center. After her death in 1915, the hospital was named the Dr. Susan Picot Memorial Hospital. Well, I think just growing up on a farm, which I did, was perfect for anybody that wants to be an author. It was ideal for me, and our senses of values and, well, the Midwest has its feet on the ground more than either coast, I think. And so it worked out with the kind of thing that I wanted to write. The members of my family were just wonderful for bringing up a little girl and who's going to be a writer. Oh yes, well, he was almost mystical. First time I ever saw him, I was in school at Peru State College. I can see him yet, the way he bounced onto that stage. I always admired him, and I saw a great deal of him. I say my audience is from 12 up through the teens, is my best audience. It's not my only audience. I've written adult novels, and I've written maybe 1 children's book, but I do not consider myself a children's writer because I write for older children, maybe. But my first editor, Bill Heiliger, said I wrote for children from young people from 9 to 90. And I do like to quote that because I hope that everybody here will fall into that category, 9 to 90. I would like to read just a little bit to you from another Omaha Indian, another LaFlesche person, Susette LaFlesche. And I never could understand how one family could name a girl Susan and Susette, same family. I never found out either. it has a subtitle, Advocate for Native American Rights. I had done 2 or 3, I've forgotten which, books for, 3 I guess, for a children's press in Chicago, and one day my telephone rang, and it was my editor from that press, and Mary, asked me, do you think you could write us a book about Susette LaFlesche? And I said, well, I did one about her sister Susan a few years ago, and I still have all of my research notes about the family. I think I could. But what I really wanted to read you a little bit about, the reason I wanted to read you a little bit from this, is that a writer has to change, if not her style or his style, at least has to turn to the kind of thing that that press wants. So it isn't always just sit down and write what you want to write, where you want to write it, and so forth. This book turned out all right, but at any rate, they do a lot of educational material, and they do a number of units that they send out to schools. And this was to be a part of an Indian unit, as you would, of course, guess. And I think you will see, even just hearing a little bit, that it's sort of a different approach, maybe even a little different style. And I'll read from chapter 1 as I did the other one. There were 4 of them, the LaFlesche sisters, daughters of Iron Eye, Joseph LaFlesche, the famous head chief of the Omaha Indians. Now, in that other book, I wouldn't have put all that in one sentence, but the students have to get the information. So here it is. They live on a reservation in the Midwest state of Nebraska. The reservation was comprised of thousands of acres of grassy, tree-splotched rolling hills that looked down on the fast-flowing Missouri River below. Here and there, the vast expanse of grasslands was broken by a huddled group of dwellings in the midst of cultivated fields. The settlement in which the LaFlesche family lived differed in appearance from the others. It was made up of frame houses, some of them 2 stories in height, whereas the other settlements were comprised of rounded earth lodges with domed roofs. Joseph LaFlesche built the first house in what was called the make-believe white man village. As a start of what he foresaw as a necessary change from the Indians' tribal ways of life to the white people's ways of living. There are so many of them, he had said, referring to the whites. They come like bees swarming. The year was 1876, and it was a year of turmoil, the first of many, for the Omaha tribes. And then again, we get back into this, what's going on, which you already know quite a bit of, but you see they don't, these students that are going to read these books. One day in early spring, excitement ran high on the Omaha reservation, and the LaFlesche sisters were in the midst of it. On a raw, windy day in March, a small, straggling band of ragged, half-starved, foot-weary Poncas appeared at Iron Eye's door, seeking refuge. The girls' excitement gave way to anger as little by little, while the decrepit, dispirited group was being warmed and fed, their story came out. Standing Bear, their leader, was the spokesperson. The Poncas' first year in the Indian Territory had been disastrous, he began. The land was so poor that they had been unable to raise decent crops, and so they did not have enough to eat. Unused to the hot, dry climate, and with inadequate food, they became ill. At least a third of the tribe had died from sickness. When Standing Bear's oldest son died, he had begged his father to return his body for burial, to the land that he had grown up in and which he loved, their homeland in Nebraska. His father had promised that this would be done. So with a few loyal friends, Standing Bear had slipped away from the territory with his son's bones in a wooden box on rickety wagons pulled by two old nags. Among them, the little band had only $20 and a small supply of food. Before them lay 500 miles. You know from the other book that Susette has been to school and does know the English language, and she interprets a great deal for her father. So he decides that they should go to Omaha City. They still called it Omaha City. When Susette and her father arrived in Omaha City, they soon learned that Mr. Tibbles, the reporter they were seeking, knew of the imprisonment of Standing Bear and the Poncas with him. He had already written articles that had appeared in the World Herald, the paper where he was assistant editor, protesting the government's heartless action. Mr. Tibbles, they were told, had gone to Fort Omaha to report the meeting between Standing Bear and the commander of the fort, General Crook. In his story, Mr. Tibbles had quoted from some of the things that were said. When the general heard Standing Bear's story, he said he was sorry, but his orders were to return the Poncas to Indian Territory. He could not disobey orders from Washington, and he had to follow them. All of this Mr. Tibbles had brought to the public through his articles. So Susette, of course, translates all of this for her father. And between and among them, I don't know which it was, they did get two lawyers, Webster and Poppleton, to work on a writ of habeas corpus to submit to the court. The biggest problem was time. The Poncas were likely to be taken south to the Indian Territory at any moment. Iron Eyes decided he and Susette should remain in the cities. They could at least give the Poncas moral support. Susette was pleased with her father's decision. And very soon, Mr. Tibbles asked Susette to do some of the writing of the articles that were going in the paper. She knew the facts, he said, and he was sure she could present them clearly and forcibly. When Mr. Tibbles showed her a copy of the petition on which so much rested, it gave her hope. In part, it read, "Your complaints were not a violation and were not guilty of any violation of any law of the United States or of any treaty of the United States for which arrest and imprisonment were made." Surely anyone could see that the Indians should be freed, thought Susette, that there was no just reason and no legal right for the Poncas' imprisonment. The courtroom was packed on April 30th, the date finally set for the hearing. When the case was continued for a second day, the crowd returned, including Susette and her father. Judge Dundee had taken several days to consider the testimony and the arguments. When his decision was handed down, Susette didn't even need to interpret for her father. The happy faces, the loud applause, and hand-slapping told the story. When the words, "An Indian is a person within the meaning of the law," were read, jubilant shouts rang out. Then the crowd quieted to hear the rest of the words. "And has the right to sue out a writ of habeas corpus in a federal court." They had won. While all who had worked on the case realized this was not the end, there would be suits and countersuits to follow, they also knew that a giant step forward had been taken for the American Indians with those 5 words of Judge Dundee's: "An Indian is a person." Besides writing his articles and having Susette write the articles for the newspaper, Mr. Tibbles also has a plan to send Susette, as I guess you know from the other one, on a lecture tour that would start with Omaha and take all of the major cities to the East Coast. And they would try to get people to see what was going on that they thought was wrong. And Tibbles starts introducing her as Bright Eyes, and he said it hadn't just happened, that he had planned it, and he intended to introduce her by that name each time they appeared, and he did from there on. I'll skip to when they have reached Chicago and are waiting to be set up various places for different talks. A reporter came to talk to Susette. She thought him positively antagonistic to her, and he exhibited no understanding of her race. Nonetheless, she held her ground, and when he asked her what she was trying to accomplish by making speeches in Chicago, she answered, "I am here to inform white people of the wrongs being done to my people." And when he followed by asking what those wrongs were, she started right in to list them. Removing us from our homelands, giving us no say on how our allotments may be spent, breaking treaties that we have signed in good faith, providing no educational facilities for our children. At this point, the reporter cut her off and asked what she wanted the government to do. She answered with dignity, "First, I want that we be given a hearing. The government pays no attention to our requests. I want them first to listen and then to act." And so they did continue this tour clear across the United States very successfully. And even after that was over, took a tour to Europe, gave a tour in England. And I think that they really did do a lot of good for the Indian cause. So I think that's enough reading from that too, and I don't have an epilogue in this, so I'll just have to read you the last sentence, I guess. Susette and Tibbles were married, did marry before the tour was out. And Susette, this is the end, last sentence. Susette LaFlesche Tibbles, Bright Eyes, symbol of Indian liberty, died peacefully on May 26, 1903, at age 48, in the house T.H. had built for her on her own plot of land. The end. Thank you.